Well, originally I came from, at that time they called it East Harbor. I was born in 1945 when a hurricane came through. My mom had to be near the midwife in case she delivered me at any moment. I attended the primary school in South Caicos. Well, of course, we call it South Caicos now, but at that time it was East Harbor. The name sort of changed when Liam McGuire came in the 60s as a surveyor with some others. The same thing happened in Providenciales. Nobody knew this island as Providenciales. They knew it as, you talk about going to Blue Hills, the north side, the Bight and Five Keys. When Fritz Luddington came, it came to it got its natural name, Providenciales. There was a legend about it. According to Gus Lightman, who has gone on now, he said I guess it was probably Christopher Columbus who discovered the West Indies and the Turks and Caicos, even though the Bahamas claimed that he landed there. Gus Lightman said that when they was coming about near Providenciales, a mist came over the land, darkness. And for hours and hours, they seemed to have been lost. They didn't know where they were going. Somehow their compass seemed to give them some problems. And when the mist cleared, they saw this beautiful island, rolling hills, pristine beaches, turquoise waters. They concluded that it was the providence of God that brought them here. And so the name Providenciales emerged. That's a legend from Gus Lightburn. Okay, I attended the all age school in East Harbor. There were when I went to school, there were about three teachers. The headmaster, Mrs. Iris Stubbs, who has gone on, and Mrs. Marjorie Baisden. Um, School opened at 9 o'clock, and there were days when the headmaster decided that he would what we call lickings for late. If you arrive late, you would get a few licks in your hand. If you didn't bring a note from your mother to say why you was late. Um, School was the school and the church were the two central things in the community. You had to leave school when you was 14. It was almost compulsory because of the people coming in. Of course, the high school was in Grand Turk. There was no system in place for you to go to high school. When I use the word system, there was no exam set that you took, and if you passed, you went to high school. Your parents either had to have somebody, as they say, to pull a string, or the headmaster thought you were brilliant enough to go to high school, and he would tell your parents. Well, I was one of those who the headmaster thought was smart enough to go to high school. And he promised my dad that he would see that I'd go to high school. This was Ronald Jones, but unfortunately, he left in the late 50s. It might have been 57 or 58. He migrated to the Bahamas. So my opportunity for high school sort of died. Um, Parents also had to pay for the children to go to high school. Um, my dad eventually had 9 of us. One died. So in the 50s, I think there was about 5 or 6 of us in the home. Um, South Caicos was like Grand Turk and Salt Cay were the three main salt islands. So the salt industry was the main employer. Apart from that, you had the fisheries. It was not as large as it is today, um, where the lobster factory came into being, I think, in 1958 or something like that, in the late 50s. Um, there were no divers like we had. There was only one local guy who was considered a diver. That was Clifford Duncanson. So they brought in divers from America, from the U.S., and some Cuban Americans who dived. But the bulk of the lobsters came from Blue Hills Provinciales. A number of persons had the sloops. What they did was they made, and the whole of this, the sort of cargo space in the sloop, they made a well that was sealed to cap water. And they had these little dinghy boats. So they were the fishermen. They went out and got the lobsters, put it inside of the hole, and every afternoon, a fast boat from South Caicos would come down. Captain Bruce Lypman was the captain. His mate was from here, but he died. That was Mr. Ewing, who was married to Rona Ewing, Harvard Ewing. And the boat would come and pick up the fish, come back in South Caicos about 7 o'clock in the night. The women would clean the lobsters, have them processed, put it in the freezer. That went on from Monday to Friday. At one time, there was a refrigeration boat, the Augusta, that came down and spent like weeks on the banks. And when they had a full load, she came into South Caicos, and it would be shipped out by air. Southern Air Transport, a company out of Miami, would come and pick up the lobsters and take them. But the Augusta had a misfortune, and she burned down. I remember clearly, in the late 50s. She burned down in the harbor in South Caicos. And we all rushed out to see what was happening. The headmaster was Mr. Jones. And when we came back, he called us all in class, and I want all of you to write an essay on the burning of the Augusta. So there we were, caught between a rock and a hard place, as it were. He said, exactly what you saw. I don't mind what your English would be like, but I want you to give an account of that. The salt industry was a dying industry. My father worked on it. He drove a truck, a 5-ton truck, Bedford truck. The salt was broken up with a peg axe. I think you know what a peg axe is, and a shovel, so that the men went into the salt pans and the brine, salt water, which had turned very thick, call it brine. They had to break it up and take the shovel and shovel it on the truck. The truck will go to a place in town, and the town area where we call it deposit, and they would have to scoop the soil out back. So you can imagine what that was like. Later on, they brought in some equipment. Well, the soil industry was being subsidized by the British government. It was not private. And initially, during the early 40s, they were locally owned, and the government took it over. So the government was putting money in for the people. You were just surviving, as it were. Later on, as I said, in the late 50s, they brought in these small tractors from England and the dump trucks. So it made life a little easier. But it was a dying industry. Young men were not prepared to go into the salt to rake any salt. So the government decided in 1964. Prior to that, they sent 2 or 3 persons from the Foreign Office in London to look at the industry, have a talk with the managers and the men who were working. At that time, the Bahamas, Inagua, and Long Island. Inagua, the salt industry there was owned by a group of brothers called the Ericksons. They later sold it to Morton. So you have Morton Salt Company now. Now, they wanted to buy out the Turks and Caicos salt from the owners, but the owners refused to do it, so they went to Inagua. And a number of persons from South Caicos, 1 or 2 from Grand Turk, went to Inagua, but the bulk from South Caicos went and worked in Inagua. That's why we had so many families from South Caicos living in Inagua. I had a number of cousins who parents moved to Inagua. Inagua had a mud modern equipment. I was in Inagua a couple of times. I took some pictures where they build this big dock um, with it went a couple of hundred yards right out. They had to do a little dredging, so the ship will come right up. The salt, the trucks will come up, dump the salt on a belt. The salt will be carried straight into the hull of the ship. Inagua is one of the largest islands in the Bahamas, so they had a lot of space, and they had the modern equipment. Diamond Salt and Long Island had never been there. They were also had modern facilities. So the government said, look, we may as well close shop on this. So in 1964, on the 31st of January, they closed the salt industry in South Caicos, and 10 years later, they closed it in Salt Key. Um, in South Caicos, when they closed it, they paid the people off. Some people were not really paid properly. When I say properly, they didn't get in. They worth more than that. But be that as it may, so the government made all of them. The government was running. We didn't have Barclays Bank or none of these banks then. The government had its own local bank. So each one had a bank book, and whatever money that they had, it was put on this book, and every week they would come and draw the money off until they had no more. So the government decided that tourism would be the next industry for it. A couple of the men were pretty old, so they retired them and give them a monthly pension. The others who were still able, the government instituted what they call a works program, in which they had these men do menial jobs, go around government places and paint it or clean it up and that sort of thing. The fishing industry continued to sustain the community. The women working the night, and they made a fairly good wage, which was able to subsidize what their um, husbands were making. My dad, every morning at about 7 o'clock, I had to take my dad tea to him. I had to walk in town, which was we lived on the bay. You talk about Cangran. We lived Cangran, and I would say it was probably in town. Let's call it. It was maybe 3 or 4 miles. I would walk and excuse me, give him his tea. My mom had his thermos and bread and other stuff, and I would sit in the truck with him. He would go to Salt Pond when he's finished. Then I would go back home. Then at midday, he would come home and get his what they call breakfast. Then at 3 o'clock, walk was over. He come home and he get his dinner. Um, at when the salt industry closed at 64, I was employed with the Turks and Caicos government. Actually, I had just started being a customs officer, untrained customs officer. All the boys my age, there were none of the boys my age worked in the salt industry. Most of them went to Grand Bahama where Freeport was just rising, and some went to sea when sailing.